place that we are going to deal with right now, that is the 17th century. So with regard to the 17th century, you would understand that this particular age has different demarcations. So as you could see, we have the Jacobean period, which is marked by the blue color. Then you have the Caroline period, which clearly indicates the reign of Charles the First. Then you have a period called the Commonwealth period. But in some books you would find that the period that dates from 1600 to 1660 is given the umbrella term the Puritan age. So we can call it the Puritan age, but you should also understand the minor subdivisions that are also present in this particular period. After the reign of Queen Elizabeth, which is a prosperous one, both in literature, politics, as well as in religion also, because you do not find any dispute with regard to religion in this particular period. And after Queen Elizabeth, you find that Queen Elizabeth is actually called the Virgin Queen. So Queen Elizabeth did not leave any heir to the throne, but she was under the presumption that it should be James the Sixth of Scotland who should succeed her as the king. And hence James the Sixth of Scotland became James the First of England. And this is kind of a turning point in the nation's history, because this is the first time when England and Scotland is ruled by a single king. It is ruled by a single monarch. And if you happen to take a look at the flag of Great Britain, or the English flag, or more specifically what would be the flag of Great Britain, you would understand that it's a combination of two different flags actually. So the English flag would have a red cross, but the Scottish flag would have a sort of the appearance of an X. So if you happen to put these two different flags together, you would actually find the British flag. So when James the First ascended the throne, he actually claimed himself the King of Great Britain. So this is kind of an important thing when you happen to take a look at the other course of events that would happen in time. So one of the major things that you have to notice about James the First is that James the First was not what we can say as the most intelligent king or the intelligent monarch, because in the reign of Elizabeth, you would find that all disputes regarding religion, politics, and every matter that should affect the country were actually solved, and this was a time of peace and prosperity. It was actually a period of thriving development. But when you come to the next monarch, actually James the First, you would understand that he was not that much of as a skilled person or a skilled king, because England has always been what would be the subject of so many religious disputes. She has always had problems with religion, because as we have seen in the previous age, we have come to understand that there are three different religious sectors that are occupying this particular country. Though Elizabeth made sure that Anglican Church was the only official church of the country, there were also some disputes in the period that is about to come. But she made it a point not to offend or make others or give room for problems for other sectors, because she was such an intelligent queen. But when you come to James the First, he was not in good terms both with the Puritans or with the Catholics, and hence there was religious trouble brewing up even at the time he became king. So one of the most important events that we should know regarding what would be the result of such an inadept ruler would be that James the First was not able to satisfy the needs of both the religious parties, and hence he was coming under pressure from the parliament. So one of the things that we should notice regarding the English parliament, or the formation of English democratic society, or the representation of the common man, you could always take yourself back to the 13th century when the Magna Carta was signed. So even from that period, even though some kings made sure that their right was the divine right of kings, there have been some development in the process of creating a valiant or a valuable government that would represent the voice of the common people. So with that said, This is a time period when the parliament was actually in full force, which was able to stand in equal terms with the king. Though the king had an upper power by his birthright, the parliament was able to control his actions if they were too far, or if they were reaching too far into the freedom of the common man. So even from the time of James the First, the problems regarding problems with the parliament was actually beginning. And with his son coming to the throne, he was much more focused upon his own rule rather than the welfare of the people, and this brought him in a more antagonistic perspective towards the parliament, and hence the clash between Charles the First and the Parliament became such a prospect of national importance because it resulted in the Civil War. Then you have the what would be the Commonwealth period. The Commonwealth period is actually a period of perfect democracy in the sense, but it was actually held under the control of Oliver Cromwell, who was the Lord Protector of England. And hence, following that, you have what would be the Restoration, which is sort of a rebirth of the monarchy form of government. And with Charles II, the monarchy comes back into existence, and this is actually and this happened around the 1660, and after that you would have who would be William the Third. So if you could see how the Tudor age ended with Elizabeth, you would find that the Stuart period is beginning with James the First, and after that you find the Stuart period coming to an end with the Hanoverian family, that is the family of William the Third, ascending the throne. So this is actually the course of history with regard to the monarchs. And if you happen to ask me the question why this particular reference mark is so important, in no other age in English literature is as closely related to the political changes of the time period than the 17th century, because you would see that all these different monarchs had a key role to play in the development of literature in this particular period. So there have been a lot of historical occurrences, but some would be prominent enough to gather our attention if we are going to see the development of English literature. So as I have mentioned earlier, when James the First became the king, he did not garner the respect as well as the love of the parliament, and hence he was without his own knowledge, he was in a sort of a religious dispute, and hence in order to curtail his rule as a king, the Gunpowder Plot by Guy Fawkes was actually enacted. So it was a plan in order to bring the king inside the parliament and fill the parliament with explosives in order to blow him up. So it was actually an assassination attempt. So if you happen to take a look at the assassination attempts that were made on the monarchs, you trace it back even to the time of William the First of Normandy. And if you happen to take a look at the previous age, in the age of Queen Elizabeth, you would find that Elizabeth's life was always at risk because of so many different plots that were aimed to kill her. So one of the most important historical occurrences in this particular period would be the theaters being closed. So the theaters being closed was actually a huge blow to the literary development of this period, because of that the English tradition of drama, the English tradition of the theater became diminished, or it became it went to a period of non-existence actually. So what was the basic cause of the theaters being closed was that because of the Civil War, and the Civil War actually was a war between those supporters of the king, and that king would be Charles the First, and those supporters of the parliament who were actually on the side of the people. So if you happen to take at the reasons for the English Civil War, you have to go to the reign of Charles the First. So Charles the First was not a king who would compromise anything for the sake of the people, and he believed in the divine right of kings, which was a sure philosophy that the king was above everyone, and the king was able to make any decision at his own will. But Charles the First took this particular philosophy so seriously that he did not prefer taking decisions based on discussions with the parliament. He even went to an extent in which he completely dissolved the parliament, and for a period of 11 years he was able to rule alone without a parliament. And this is something that was quite new in this particular period, because no ruler or no monarch aimed to do such a drastic measure. but drastic measures were met with drastic results because the Charles the First was not an able king. He was always in need of money, and this need of money was often questioned by the parliament. And this is these were the basis on which he began to hate the parliament, and and he dissolved it eventually. So when the need for money rose again, he started making wild plans of of increasing taxes on the common man. So this was actually met by one ridiculous kind of tax, and that was the ship tax. Or so the basic concept behind this particular tax was that those people who were living in the coastal areas had to pay ship tax in order to fund their own protection from sea invasions. Because if you happen to know the history of England, you would often see invaders coming through the sea. So this tax was actually something that was levied only on those people in the coastal areas. But in the time of Charles the First, he actually levied these taxes on those people who are living in the interior or in the central part of the island. And this was becoming much of a nuisance, and hence problems began piling up one after the other. And this led to what would be the Civil War. And in the Civil War, you find two different factions fighting over each other. One would be the Royalists, who were the supporters of Charles the First, and the other were the Roundheads, who were actually members of the parliament and who actually supported the needs of the common man. And this civil war lasted for a considerable amount of time, and it had its own effect. And one of the most important effects that it had was the what would be the domination of the Puritan regime, as well as the closing of theaters. So as we have seen in the previous period, we would find that the theater is the most dominant literary form. So if you happen to take a look at the theaters being closed in this particular period, you would understand how much of a loss the literature of this age is going to meet with regard to this political decision. So what was the reason for closing theaters? So there have been a lot of speculations, and one of them actually was that the Royalists used these theaters in order to make their underground plans regarding what would be coups and other measures in order to revolt against what would be the current regime. So another important reason that has been circulated ever since the theaters were forced to close was that theaters were at that time did not lack any use for the development of the nation, and this is something that we cannot pass over as correct. And the whatever the reason might be, this led to a huge degradation of literary activity. So then you have the Great Plague. The Great Plague is actually it was not actually that much of a big deal in most part of the island, because it happened to affect only a single portion of it, but it was able to snatch away more than 1 million lives at that particular period. And the plague lasted for almost 2 years, and this is actually turned into a huge historical occasion, because many writers who have come after this period have made sure to take note upon this particular episode in British history and turn it into so many works of literary creations. So then you have the Glorious Revolution. So as I have mentioned earlier, we have what would be a series of monarchs that occupied this particular piece of land. And if you happen to take a look at the latest or the last monarch of this particular period, you would find that it is William III. So this Glorious Revolution is an important thing in this particular history, because this is quite different from all the other ways in which kings and queens have ascended the throne. Because if you happen to take a look at who would be James the Second, James the Second is actually the son of Charles the First, and James the Second, he was the king for a considerable amount of time. James the Second is actually the son of Charles the First, and James the First actually he has two daughters, Mary and Anne, and Mary was actually married to William III. So when James the Glorious Revolution is actually so important, because this was the first time in English history that no blood was shed and no great war was occurred in order to in order to make the shift from one monarch to the other. It is kind of a peaceful way of bringing a monarch to power, because William III became the monarch only because the parliament allowed him to. So this is kind of a democratic step. If you happen to take the whole history of the whole history of England. So if this particular age that we are going to see is a combination of three different literary periods, and if you happen to take a look at any history of English literature book, you would understand that this period from 1600 to 1660 is collectively called the Puritan period. So that is correct if you happen to take the perspective of the religious writings that came in the period, or the themes or the religious themes that were so dominant in this particular period. But if you happen to take a political or a sociological perspective, you would understand that the Jacobean period is actually the reign of King James, and Caroline period is actually the reign of Charles I. And this period from 1660 to 1700 is the Restoration period, because this is demarcated quite clearly in all of the history of English literature books, because the next stage, which is the Augustan age, actually begins from 1700. So we can be sure that this period extends from 1660 to 1700. So as I mentioned earlier, this particular period, which marks the first half of the 17th century, is actually the Puritan period.